Immerse yourself in a serene journey through the veil of ancient Greek lore, where myths intertwine with the quiet moments of bygone eras. Let the day's noise subside as you delve into these tales. These stories transport us to a time when mighty gods walked the earth among mortals, when heroes faced seemingly insurmountable trials, and ordinary people lived measured lives under the gentle Mediterranean sun. We will delve into those subtle moments often overlooked by history, anticipation, labour, contemplation. Dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let the narrative draw you in. The weight of chains being forged deep underground, in workshops so far removed that sunlight never penetrated their walls, becomes almost palpable. The Cyclops labour tirelessly. Their massive hands move with meticulous precision, shaping links of metal destined to restrain the most dangerous creature ever known to the world. But let us begin at the very start, at the moment when the earth itself was consumed by rage. Gaia, the ancient Mother Earth, grew weary of witnessing her children's suffering. The Titans, her firstborn giants, had been cast into the deepest abyss of the underworld by Zeus and his brothers. For years she felt their pain echo in her very being. Every clap of Zeus's thunder seemed a mockery. Every lightning bolt served as a reminder of what he had done to her family. So she resolved to create something new, something that could challenge the king of the gods himself. In the deepest caverns, where the earth's heat formed pools of molten rock, Gaia began her creation. She blended earth and fire, wrath and might, forging a creature so terrifying that even she wondered if she had gone too far. This being would be named Typhon, and it would be unlike anything that had ever existed. Imagine a giant so tall his head brushed the stars. His arms could stretch from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Instead of fingers, he had serpent heads that hissed and snapped, driven by their own furious minds. His eyes glowed like embers in a forge, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like 100 volcanoes erupting simultaneously. But here's what makes this story perfect for such a quiet evening. Most of Typhon's existence wasn't spent in epic battles. For much of his time he simply existed, growing, waiting, learning what it meant to be in a world that suddenly seemed very small. You see, when Typhon first emerged from the earth, he didn't immediately rush to fight Zeus. He spent days just looking around. Imagine how strange that must have been for him, to see the sky for the first time, to feel the wind, the actual moving air on his massive body, the sensation of sunlight warming his stony skin. He walked slowly across the land, and with each step, mountains crumbled, not because he sought to destroy them, but simply because he was so enormous that the earth could not properly bear his weight. Villages emptied as people felt the earthquake miles away. But Typhon barely noticed these tiny settlements. He looked upward, studying the abode of the gods. Mount Olympus towered in the distance, and even from afar, Typhon felt the power emanating from it. He smelled the ambrosia, heard the faint sounds of divine laughter, sensed the electricity that always surrounded Zeus, and slowly, quietly, his purpose became clear. An interesting feature of monsters in Greek myths is that they are often not evil in the way we might expect. Typhon was not filled with malice or hatred for hatred's sake. He was filled with purpose. His mother created him for one specific task: to challenge the order established by Zeus, to ask a question no one else dared to ask. Who decided that you should rule everything? See, so Typhon began his slow journey toward Olympus. But first he needed to test his strength. He started small, he breathed on forests and watched them burst into flame, dipped his serpentine fingers into the sea and boiled the water, and quietly roared, what he considered quiet, and listened as his voice echoed across 3 mountain ranges. The gods, of course, noticed him immediately. It was impossible for a creature the size of a mountain to roam unnoticed, but their first reaction was not to attack. It was to observe and wait. Zeus stood on his balcony, gazing at this new threat, and for the first time in centuries he felt something he had almost forgotten: uncertainty. Not fear, but an awareness that this battle would be different from all previous ones. Hera stood beside him, unusually quiet. Even she, who had opposed Zeus in countless intrigues and conspiracies, saw that Typhon represented something more than their usual family drama. It wasn't about who would sit on which throne. It was about whether their world would exist at all. The other gods began preparations, not for battle yet. First, they began to prepare for retreat. And here the story becomes almost comical. These powerful, immortal beings, who ruled all aspects of life on earth, packed their bags and fled to Egypt. They disguised themselves as animals and hid. Apollo became a raven, Artemis transformed into a cat, Hermes became an ibis, probably because he deemed it fitting. Even the god of war himself turned into a fish and swam away as fast as he could. But Zeus could not flee, not because he was braver than the others, but because he was king. Kings cannot abandon their realms even when their realms are in the sky. And their enemy was a giant with serpentine fingers who could boil the sea with his breath. So Zeus remained in his place and waited. The battle, when it finally erupted, shook the entire world. But before we speak of the combat, let us speak of the preparation. For preparation, as you know, is often more interesting than the event itself. Zeus spent 3 days preparing. He polished his lightning bolts, sharpened his thunders, and practiced his aim. He ate carefully, choosing foods that would give him strength without making him heavy. He slept a long, serene sleep, accumulating energy for what he knew would be the longest battle of his immortal life. Typhon, meanwhile, also prepared, but in his own way he sat by the ocean, dipping his serpentine fingers into the water, allowing them to acclimate to the sensation of movement in fluid. He practiced his roar, starting quietly and gradually increasing the volume, until sea creatures fled to the deepest trenches. He tested his fiery breath on empty islands, learning to control its temperature and direction. Both knew that this battle would determine the future of everything. If Zeus won, the order he established would endure. The gods would rule from Olympus. Mortals would live their lives below, and the natural laws governing the universe would remain stable. If Typhon won, chaos would return. Not necessarily an evil chaos, but the kind of chaos that existed before Zeus and his brothers organized the world into neat, predictable categories. A chaos where anything could happen, where natural laws were more like suggestions, where mortals, gods, and monsters shared the same uncertain world. The battle itself lasted 7 days. 7 days of lightning visible from all corners of the earth. 7 days of roars that triggered avalanches in mountain ranges hundreds of miles away. 7 days the earth shook so violently that new islands rose from the sea and old ones sank beneath the waves. But what's interesting about this battle isn't the dramatic moments. It's the quiet moments between them. The brief pauses when both combatants stop to catch their breath. The way Zeus looked at the scorched earth and wondered what they were truly fighting for. The way Typhon gazed at the stars and remembered that his mother had made him from the same earth that created those distant lights. On the seventh day, Zeus managed to deliver a perfect strike. His largest lightning bolt hit Typhon squarely in the chest, and the giant creature collapsed. But Zeus did not celebrate. Instead, he stood quietly, looking at his vanquished foe, and felt something unexpected. A sadness. Typhon was not dead. Gods and monsters do not die easily in Greek myths. But he was defeated, and as Zeus called for those special chains we spoke of at the beginning, he understood that victory and triumph were not always the same thing. The Cyclops brought their masterpieces, chains forged from metal mined from the hearts of dying stars, cooled by the tears of the earth itself, blessed by powers more ancient than any of the gods. These chains would hold more than just Typhon's body. They would contain his very essence, his ability to challenge the established order. As they wrapped the chains around Typhon's massive body, the giant spoke for the first time since the battle began. His voice was now quiet, barely audible compared to his former roars. "This is not over," he said, and Zeus nodded. "I know," Zeus replied, for both of them understood what the other gods hiding in Egypt had yet to realize. The chains could hold Typhon's body, but they could not hold the question he represented. A question that would echo through every generation of gods and mortals to come. Who decided that things should be this way? Typhon, the mighty Titan, was buried deep beneath Mount Etna, and since then that mountain has become a living volcano. Whenever the giant stirs in his subterranean bonds, Etna awakens, spewing fiery flows. Even today, millennia later, when the volcano rumbles awake, some whisper that it is Typhon, longing for freedom, testing the strength of his ancient chain. Zeus, the great thunderer, returned to Olympus, and the other Olympians also left Egypt, resuming the usual course of their existence as if nothing had happened. However, Zeus often stood on his high balcony, gazing at the distant glow of Etna, and pondered what would happen when those bonds eventually thinned and broke. And in the quiet of this evening, as each of us settles into comfort, one might ask oneself, what will happen when that which challenges everything finally breaks free? What will occur when the question no one dares to ask is finally spoken aloud? The chains that bound Typhon had not yet cooled from the forge's heat when the earth trembled again. But this time the cause was not a single gigantic colossus. This time there was the sound of footsteps. Many, many footsteps, all moving in the same direction. Gaia, the progenitor of all existence, had lost her mighty defender, but her resentment towards Zeus and his family had not subsided. If one monster could not overcome the gods, perhaps an army could. And so Gaia retreated to her most fertile valleys and began to cultivate a new kind of offspring, the giants. They were not like Typhon, born of rage and destructive fire. These giants were the fruit of patience and unwavering determination. They grew slowly, like ancient trees, taking decades to reach their full, colossal height. And as they grew, they learned. Gaia, observing Typhon's defeat, realized something profoundly important. Brute force alone was not enough to challenge the gods. Her new children needed strategy, the ability to act in concert, and most importantly, time. Thus, the giants spent their childhood, which lasted about 50 years, studying their enemies. They observed the gods from hidden valleys, meticulously noting their habits, strengths, and weaknesses. They learned that Zeus was most powerful during thunderstorms, but became vulnerable in clear, serene weather. They discovered that Poseidon lost his might the further he moved from any body of water. They noticed that Hades rarely left his gloomy underworld realm, which made him predictable. The giants were methodical and thorough, which was perfectly suited to such a leisurely, vigilance-lulling story. They were in no hurry. They planned, prepared, and practiced with the same persistent determination with which a person might work on a long and complex project. Their leader was Alcyoneus, a giant who possessed the astonishing ability to become immortal as long as he remained on the ground where he was born. This meant he could never leave his native valley to fight, but it also meant he could coordinate the war from a position of absolute safety. It's worth pausing to consider this for a moment. The leader of this great rebellion against the gods was, in essence, confined to his backyard. He could send messages, devise plans, and issue orders, but he could not personally participate in any of the battles he orchestrated. There is something both tragic and comical in this situation. Another giant, the unfortunate Porphyrion, fell in love with Hera at first sight, seeing her from afar. His entire motivation for joining the war wasn't so much to challenge Zeus's authority. He simply yearned to gain Hera's attention. Of course, trying to impress someone by starting a war against her husband was probably not the most thoughtful or subtle approach. But the giants were not known for their high emotional intelligence. Ephialtes and Otus, two giant brothers, had an even more specific goal. They desired to abduct Artemis and Aphrodite and make them their wives. Their plan involved building a mountain tall enough to reach Olympus by stacking 3 different peaks on top of each other. For years they moved stones one by one, creating in essence the world's most ambitious landscaping project. The slowness of their work was almost meditative. Day after day the two brothers would wake before dawn, eat a simple breakfast of bread and honey, and then spend 14 hours hauling stones up the mountainside. They spoke little during these labour sessions, communicating mostly with grunts and gestures. In the evenings they would sit by their fire, looking at their growing mountain, and make small adjustments to their plans. Perhaps the peak should be a little more to the left, Ephialtes might say. Agreed, Otus would reply, and the next day they would shift their entire project slightly westward. It took them 3 years to build their mountain staircase, and by the time they finished, they had almost forgotten why they were building it. The work itself had become more important than the original goal. Meanwhile, the gods watched all this activity with growing apprehension. It was one thing to face a single enemy, even one as mighty as Typhon. It was quite another to confront a coordinated army that had been planning its assault for decades. Zeus called a family meeting which, in the case of the Greek gods, meant a great deal of arguing, blaming, and dramatic gestures. Hera accused Zeus of creating the situation by overthrowing the Titans. Poseidon suggested simply flooding the entire earth and starting over with new mortals who might be more grateful. Athena, always practical and judicious, pointed out that they needed to understand what the giants truly wanted before they could figure out how to stop them. What if we just give them some lesser deity? Apollo suggested. A few small islands to rule, perhaps some authority over certain types of weather. Absolutely not, Zeus replied decisively. If we start negotiating with rebels, every monster and minor deity in the world will think they can make demands. Hermes, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. I've been observing them, he said. They're not like Typhon. They don't want to destroy everything. They just want respect. Recognition, I think. This observation led to a long, thoughtful silence. For respect was something the gods rarely deemed necessary to show anyone outside their immediate family. The idea that these giants might have legitimate grievances was more unsettling than the thought that they were simply monsters bent on destruction. But before the gods could find a diplomatic solution, the war began. It started almost by accident. Hermes was delivering a message to a mortal king when he flew too close to the giant's main encampment. One of the younger giants, excited to finally see a god up close, threw a boulder at him. Not necessarily trying to harm him, but more like a child throwing a ball to get someone's attention. The boulder missed Hermes, but destroyed a temple dedicated to Zeus that stood on a nearby hill. Zeus saw the destruction, assumed it was a deliberate attack, and responded with a lightning bolt that singed the hair off 3 different giants. And just like that, the war began. But this war was different from the short, intense battle with Typhon. It was a slow, grueling conflict that lasted for years. The giants had the advantage of size and strength, but the gods had the advantage of mobility and magic. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The giants would spend weeks positioning massive boulders for a coordinated assault on Olympus. The gods would respond by conjuring storms that made it impossible for the giants to see their targets. The giants would retreat to their caves to weather the storm. The gods would use this time to repair any damage and plan their next move. Months would pass without any major battles, only small skirmishes, brief encounters, and a great deal of waiting. During one such quiet period, something interesting happened. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, was travelling through a valley when she encountered a group of young giants tending a garden. These giants were not preparing for war. They were growing vegetables. Demeter, whose job it was to help all things grow, was fascinated by their techniques. The giants had developed a composting method that created incredibly fertile soil. They had bred new varieties of beans that could grow in rocky ground. They had trained wild grapevines to produce fruit twice the usual size. Before she realized what she was doing, Demeter began to offer advice. If you plant those carrots a little deeper, they'll grow straighter, she told a giant who was probably young enough to be her great-great-great-grandchild. If gods and giants calculated relationships the way mortals did. Really? The giant asked, his voice so full of genuine curiosity that Demeter momentarily forgot they were supposed to be enemies. She spent the entire day teaching them about crop rotation, soil pH, and the best moon phases for planting different kinds of seeds. They listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and offered her some of their bread and cheese in payment for the lesson. It was the most peaceful day Demeter had experienced since the war began. But when she returned to Olympus and told the other gods about her encounter, Zeus was furious. "You fraternize with the enemy," he accused. "They're gardeners," Demeter replied. "They grow food. How does that make them my enemies?" This argument revealed something none of the gods wanted to admit. They weren't entirely sure why they were fighting this war. The giants wanted recognition and respect. The gods wanted to maintain their power. But power over what exactly? And why couldn't there be a place in the world for both gods and giants? Wars, unfortunately, possess their own inertia, continuing to roll across the world even when those who wage them begin to doubt their original purpose. Conflicts drag on not because of the will to continue, but because it takes far greater true courage to end them. So it was that this ancient war concluded not in a grand, sky-shattering battle, but due to an ancient prophecy. An oracle foretold that the colossal giants could only be defeated if a mortal stood shoulder to shoulder with the gods. This meant Zeus had to find a human hero, brave enough to challenge enemies whose size was comparable to mountains. His choice fell upon Heracles, a demigod and half-human, already renowned for his fearless bravery and countless adventures. However, even with Heracles valiantly fighting alongside them, the ultimate victory proved far less spectacular than one might imagine. The giants were defeated one by one in a series of small scattered skirmishes. Alcyoneus was cunningly lured from his native valley, where he lost his immortality. Porphyrion fell under the combined assault of Zeus and Heracles. The giant brothers Ephialtes and Otus died at the hand of Artemis, not because of their attempt to abduct her, but because they accidentally destroyed one of her sacred groves while building their own mountain. The war concluded almost imperceptibly, without a dramatic climax. The surviving giants retreated to remote islands and deep caves, where, legend has it, they reside to this day. Some stories claim they never again attempted to rebel against the gods, but never fully reconciled themselves to their defeat either. Zeus, having declared victory, returned to ruling the world. Nevertheless, something subtle had changed. The gods no longer felt their former unwavering confidence in their power. They realized that power based solely on might could always be challenged by someone stronger, more determined, or more patient. And in the quiet moments between claps of thunder, as Zeus stood alone on his balcony, gazing at the world, he sometimes wondered if Demeter had been right. Perhaps the giants were not enemies at all. Perhaps they were just different. As evening descends and consciousness drifts towards sleep, one might reflect on those gardens tended by the young giants. Somewhere in a hidden valley, tomatoes and carrots may still grow in soil enriched by ancient composting methods, and perhaps that is a far more enduring victory than any battle. Deep beneath majestic Mount Olympus, where the rock itself glows crimson from the furious heat blazing since the world's inception, lies a workshop that never sleeps. The clang of the hammer echoes through chambers carved into living stone, and the air shimmers with such a temperature that everything seems submerged under water. Here Hephaestus toils, and his story begins not with the grand battles we have already explored, but with something far quieter and profoundly human, the simple yet powerful need to create beauty. Hephaestus was not only the smith of the gods, but also their outcast. When he came into the world, his mother, Hera, looked upon him and felt only disappointment. He did not possess Apollo's beauty, Ares' strength, or Athena's wisdom. He was small. His legs seemed weak, and his face appeared far more accustomed to squinting at flames than to lighting up with a smile at courtly celebrations. Therefore Hera committed an act that seems unthinkable to comprehend. She hurled her own infant from Mount Olympus. Imagine a fall lasting an entire day, tumbling through clouds and past soaring birds, watching the world below grow larger and larger until finally a splash in the ocean near a small island called Lemnos. Imagine being rescued by sea nymphs who carried him to their underwater caves and cared for him as their own child. The sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynome cared not at all that Hephaestus was not handsome. What mattered to them was that he was curious, intelligent, and incredibly determined. While other children might indulge in games, Hephaestus studied the structure of shells, explored patterns in corals, and learned how crabs managed to regrow new claws. By the age of 10, he had already built his first forge from volcanic rock and driftwood. It looked humble and unassuming, but performed its function reliably. He learned to control fire not through magic, but through careful observation and patient practice. He discovered which types of seaweed, dried and burned, created the hottest flames. He figured out how to use tidal pools as natural cooling baths for red-hot metal. The nymphs would watch him work for hours, without a word. There was something hypnotic in the rhythm of his hammer, the way he could look at a piece of raw metal and see the finished tool within it. His labour demanded such focused attention that it was akin to meditation. When Hephaestus turned 16, he created something that changed everything. A golden throne, so beautiful it seemed to capture sunlight and hold it within itself. The throne was covered in intricate patterns that appeared to move if viewed from different angles. Flowers that seemed to open and close, birds that seemed to preen their feathers, waves that looked as if they truly flowed. He sent this throne to Olympus as a gift for his mother. Hera was delighted when the mysterious gift arrived. She had no idea who sent it, but she couldn't resist the temptation to sit and examine the exquisite craftsmanship more closely. The throne proved so comfortable, so perfectly designed for her exact size and preferences, that she settled in for a long, luxurious rest. It was then that she discovered the trap. The throne was equipped with invisible golden chains that activated the moment someone sat down. The more Hera struggled to rise, the tighter the chains became. She found herself ensnared, a prisoner of the most beautiful piece of furniture ever created. The other gods tried everything they could think of to free her. Zeus struck the throne with lightning, but the chains absorbed the electricity and used it to become only stronger. Poseidon flooded the throne room, but the water simply flowed around Hera, leaving the golden bonds unaffected. Ares tried to break the chains with his sword, but the blade shattered on contact. Finally, Hermes examined the throne more closely and discovered a small inscription hidden at the base. Made by Hephaestus, son of Hera, with love and respect. Zeus immediately sent messengers to search for this mysterious craftsman, and when they found him in his island workshop, what they saw astonished them. Hephaestus had spent years building a forge that was part workshop, part art gallery, and part engineering laboratory. The walls were hung with tools that seemed to organize themselves. Hammers hung in perfect order by size. Chisels remained sharp without needing sharpening. Tongs automatically adjusted their grip to whatever object they held. The anvil was forged from a solid piece of meteoric iron that had fallen from space, and when struck, it rang with perfect musical tones. But the most impressive part of the workshop was not the equipment at all. It was the patience that permeated every project. Hephaestus worked on some items for decades, adding the tiniest details year after year, perfecting them with a dedication that only comes from true love for one's craft. There were bells made of metal so thin it was almost transparent, tuned to melodies that changed with the weather. There was a mirror that showed not a person's current appearance, but how they would look if they were perfectly healthy and completely happy. There was a lamp that burned without fuel, its flame powered by the craftsman's own satisfaction in his work. The messengers found Hephaestus in the midst of his daily routine. He woke before dawn, as he had every day for years, and began by cleaning his tools, not because they were dirty, but because the quiet, repetitive action helped him focus his mind on the work ahead. He ate a simple breakfast, bread, cheese, fruit and water, while studying the drawings he had made the night before. These were not blueprints in the modern sense, but rather poems written in the language of metal and fire, curves that suggested possibilities, angles that implied strength, dimensions that hinted at perfect balance. After breakfast, he would light his forge and for several minutes simply watch the flames, doing nothing, just gazing at how the fire moved, what colours it created, what sounds it made as it consumed different kinds of fuel. This daily meditation taught him things about fire that most gods never learned, despite their far greater power. When the messengers explained why they had come, Hephaestus nodded thoughtfully. She wishes to be freed from the throne. He asked. Yes, they replied. Zeus commands you to release her immediately. Hephaestus smiled, not with malice, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose plan had worked exactly as intended. I will free her, he said. But first I wish to visit Mount Olympus. I wish to see my family. The messengers agreed, though they were not certain Zeus would be pleased with these terms. Upon their return to majestic Olympus, accompanied by Hephaestus, the Olympian gods were astonished by the sight that met their eyes. Their expectations had leaned toward encountering either a repulsive monster or a humbled supplicant seeking mercy. Instead, before them stood a silent, dignified master, whose eyes critically scanned their opulent halls, much like a skilled connoisseur meticulously inspecting the quality of workmanship. Remarkable architecture indeed, Hephaestus declared, carefully examining the golden columns that proudly supported the throne room's vaults. Nevertheless, the joints could be reinforced and the proportions are somewhat skewed. For true acoustic perfection, the ceiling should either be raised by 3 feet or lowered by 5. He slowly approached Hera, who was still captive in her golden throne, futilely trying to free herself from the unseen but strong bonds. Greetings, Mother. His quiet address resonated. Hera, for the first time since his birth, truly looked at him without prejudice. Her gaze caught the burn marks on his hands, a testament to long years of incessant work with scorching fire. She noticed how his shoulders had developed, hardened by the constant swings of a heavy hammer. In the depths of his eyes she discerned formidable intelligence, boundless patience, and something utterly unexpected that moved her deeply: forgiveness. I crafted this throne, striving for its impeccable suitability for you alone, Hephaestus explained, his voice imbued with unwavering confidence. For many months I observed you from afar, meticulously studying your precise measurements, your exquisite preferences, your established habits. My sincere desire was to create something that would allow you to feel like the true queen you undoubtedly are. The fury that had simmered in Hera's heart began to subside, giving way first to vague confusion, And then, like a slowly descending curtain, a profound sense of shame. The bonds were absolutely necessary, Hephaestus continued, his gaze remaining calm. For I knew with certainty that you would never stay still long enough to hear what I wished to tell you, were you given the